Hello, everyone, and welcome to the War Report. We're back for another episode, another week of exciting news. And I'm going to change it up a little. I usually like to start in the Middle East. That's traditionally how I've done the show. Now, of course, I've oscillated here and there. But because there's so much news out of the Middle East, I'm sure you've all seen it. The rapid advance through Afghanistan, Turkey's newest moves, the dispute between Iraq, Syria, and the U.S., and the spillover and the unrest in Lebanon, the strikes, the nuclear negotiations. But I want to, again, just start with our brief Eastern European news, to the point where Russia and Belarus have taken one step closer to being integrated countries. Now, previously, again, there were steps being taken, especially after the color revolutions in Belarus back in August, where now the border has always been, for Russians at least, and for Belarusians, maybe not like outsiders in either one, it's been more or less an easy cross. And of course, there's families on the other side. There are people who are very closely related, and again, a lot of self identified Russians in Belarus, and a lot of Belarusians speak Russian as a primary language. So, plenty of integration before from the Soviet era, from even before that with the Russian Empire. And they've taken a pretty major leap towards integration by standardizing their tax codes with one another to the point where they can be on financially the same footing, that they can tax their people the same amount and apply the same regulations and amounts to various individuals, organizations, and businesses. Now, one may think tax structuring is a mundane topic, something that doesn't really get discussed on the war report, but in this case, this seems monumental. After all the things, after all the speculation, now of course it's supposed to have been since the 90s where the two countries were supposed to work on unification with the Union State, and that has been hemmed and hawed. Strangely enough, Putin actually coming to power delayed a lot of that. Whereas Lukashenko, I think his big push towards glory is he wanted to be the leader of this new unified Belarusian Russian state, and that Putin's stabilization of Russia more or less stole the spotlight for him, which some people, I wouldn't go this far, speculate that's a point of major resentment between the two. Now, I do think that the relationship probably isn't the warmest and the friendliest. Definitely not the puppet master relationship that they want you to believe it is, but I don't think it's to that point of embitterment and resentment, to the point where, again, Lukashenko decides to cooperate with the European Union just because he has some sort of feud with Putin over something that happened 25 years ago. At this point, I don't think that's the case, but it is. Speaking of the European Union, Belarus has been reversing its moves towards integration with the West after, again, several decades. Lukashenko has always tried to walk this tightrope. He's really been like Erdogan without the major power and influence that Turkey wields in its respective region and in the terms of the global chessboard. But he's always tried to walk that tightrope between the Russians being a mostly Russophone country with a lot of pro Russian sentiments, and the wealth and temptation of going westward, of going to Brussels, going to Washington, etc. And it looks like he's taken another step in order to be able to integrate himself with the more Russian side, which I don't think many people are surprised about. And again, I would say with that, again, there's also integration into energy, transportation, agriculture, and industry in general. So it looks like pen is actually being put to paper and things are actually getting done rather than just speculations and statements and warm feelings by both sides.
Right, and it's moved out of the EU's Eastern Partnership, and the integration on tax and industry and everything else started literally the next day. So I think this will stymie any effort to for the West to foment a color revolution that will pull Belarus not just into the into the EU and American hands, but particularly with regard to the Baltic states and Poland. because Poland has been and Lithuania have been the most eager to see this happen. This has been I remember watching. This is a decades long project. I think Poland and Lithuania were the most eager to get Minsk torn away and brought into the EU, but brought into what I would see as a kind of um, unequal partnership or lesser country than with respect to the Visegrad group, and basically be set up as a bulwark against Russia. Uh, I know that one of the scenarios for a future war with Russia was essentially Kaliningrad is cut off. It's not explained why Kaliningrad is cut off, but Kaliningrad is cut off. I can only assume that Western powers, in frustration with Russia, let's say before or after they lose Belarus, are blocked from Kaliningrad. What would they do? How would that scenario roll out? So that would probably mean there would be an embargo on Kaliningrad and so on and so on. Now with Belarus, firmly within Russia, this means that the corridor leading from Belarus into Kaliningrad, and legally there is a path going there which bifurcates its way between Latvia and Lithuania. That's going to be called in question. I'm very sure that will be the next step, because this will be quite a blow. And to be honest, it's a decades-long project. I remember when the war in Ukraine broke out, and there was an analyst, a Russian analyst named Starikov, and I don't see much of him anymore, but I saw a lot of him in 2014 and 15, and a bit in 2016. And they would talk about, like, getting their people situated in Minsk ahead of a visit by an American diplomat or an EU diplomat in order to stop protests or identify people who might be creating a color revolution. And so I think now it's obvious that it's going to be much harder to foment a color revolution in Belarus. I think it's a done deal. Belarus is not going to be an independent state dependent on the EU or the US. And it's another example of where a hard border is being drawn more and more clearly over these last 7 years about what can and cannot be tolerated uh, between Russia and the West. So um, it's another instance of an Eastern push, uh, where the country in question, uh, in effect, like Crimea, falls more securely within Russian control.
And I am really waiting for the "this is Putler's Danzig" sort of things, especially with the Kaliningrad situation. Them trying to say this is just like when Hitler did. Blah, 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 blah. It seems like they've been softer with that rhetoric lately. Strangely enough, the liberals have been less belligerent even than they were under both Obama and Trump when it comes to the Russia issue. Again, I don't know the reasoning for that. I'm wondering they're probably going to pull out their cards, even though I could very easily see the Western quote unquote conservatives very well say this, saying that we need to be strong and it's like World War II, guys. Totally, it's a World War II reference, and we need to stand up to Putler because they're like the new Nazi Germany or whatever the talking point's going to be on that end. And I I do have to bring into question the morale gain and loss of each side of this when it comes to Belarus, because I know the Russian people, especially with the historical and just geopolitical significance of Crimea having something that's just so key to the Russian land in both of what it represents in its history and of the position it gives on the Black Sea. I know that was very popular among the Russian people. I know that buoyed Putin's support a lot. I'm not sure, and again,
Yeah.
I suppose we'll have to bring Vile Varangian back on or something. What integrating Belarus, if say by the end of this year or beginning of next year, maybe they're not officially integrated, but they're more or less integrated. I wonder what the morale effect will be on that in Russia. If the Russian people will be enthused about that and thinking we've reunited a key part of our homeland like they were with Crimea. I would imagine less so. I know that the opinions were pretty split, especially before the Color Revolution, about whether Belarus should be integrated or not. And I know that, of course, a lot more Belarusians have been supportive of that, and that will buoy Russia's population up if they actually do go through with it. Something upwards of 10 million. Of course, the economic disparity will probably have a lot of, once things would be completely open, once it'd be integrated, you would probably have a lot of Belarusians leaving for the, well, what was part of the Russian Federation before the integration, seeking economic opportunity. And I know that Russia has lower birth rates like most modern nations, and it's also again with that. So I I wonder what that will do to the economy of Russia. I wonder that will do to the morale or feelings of the Russian people. But I think even if it isn't on the same degree as Crimea, which I don't think it's going to be, or even if it's some very split down the middle decision whether they're happy or not, Belarus is integrated. I do think it will certainly be a morale blow for the West, the EU, and NATO, and
Mm.
especially for these Eastern European states that have tried to orient themselves westward, such as Poland, such as Romania, the Baltic states, that a former, not only Eastern Bloc country, but a former Soviet republic just reintegrated South Russia. I think that will probably be the biggest PR loss in quite some time for them, probably since the annexation of Crimea and the Russian intervention in Syria. The fact that, of course, they're going to justify it, saying Russia annexed this territory, Russia took it by force, blah 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 blah. Really play with the propaganda there, but I do think it will be not not like devastating, but I think it'll be a bit crushing for these countries that have been trying to wage this propaganda war against Russia that one of its former Soviet republics willingly returned to integrate with it.
Yeah, it will be the loss of a PR stunt. It will kind of show a loss of power and prestige. Of course, it will fuel Russia as the main adversary of Europe. But that was going to happen anyways, because a lot of the objectives that the EU and particularly that America had wanted there to um, happen between Russia and Europe have not. And so that was inevitable anyways, right? Like Russia isn't going to avoid sanctions by not having uh, you know, Belarus within its borders. That's the like not until Russia is like firmly part of the West and or Balkanized can that ever happen. So like, and I think the way Putin has played this the last 7 years has been really good. Like he's made the moves that he can make at the time that he can make them. Uh, Being careful because 7 years ago, a lot of the, let's say, economic mechanisms that have been put in place were not there. So it was a greater risk of what that might do to Russia, considering what an economically devastating year 2008, 2009 were, right? With the housing bubble that had far-reaching effects. Now, it affected Russia, but it did not affect Russia in the same way that it affected some other countries. And of course, countries like Canada were almost not affected at all by it. It, I mean, let's say in comparison, there was a small effect, but generally none of the problems that you saw happening in America. So um, he's played this very wisely, I think. There's more that Russia can do now. There are indications that even China has decided that it will change its grain imports. It will reduce the amount of soy and increase the amount of wheat, and in so doing, will shift most of its agricultural imports for grain from the U.S. and with Russia. So that's going to boost the economy as well.
Yeah, and that's
Uh,
another thing about the Russian Chinese relationship. And I know that they also had those energy deals and that China proceeded to buy oil from Russia. A lot of people, when they talk about Russian Chinese relations, I think have this very strange idea of what the dynamics are because admittedly it did start as a marriage of convenience. Admittedly, Russia and China have historically not been the best of friends. But it does seem like there has been a bit of falling. I wouldn't say that they view each other as brotherly people or anything like that. But another conception is that neoconservatives were very big fans of this sort of rhetoric in the 2000s that, well, you see, Russia is eventually just going to get subsumed by China in terms of global influence, which I do think China will suppress Russian global influence. Not that's going to be a complete eclipsing, but I do think China will, because I know, like, in terms of military power, Russia still technically outclasses China, but in terms of global reach, China, I would say, outclasses Russia at this point, but that's aside the point. But when Russia has become a major food and energy exporter to China, it isn't nearly as lopsided of a relationship as it seems. Now, of course, China and their economic dealings with Russia provide some much needed relief from the Western sanctions, but if relations, for whatever reason, if there were another, Sino-Russian split, so to speak, it wouldn't collapse either. Now, both of them would be in a much more disadvantaged position, but it's not like China would just keep chugging along without Russia, considering the fact of how much, energy they've imported from them, as we were saying. And now, of course, there are alternate sources like Iran, their deals in Saudi Arabia and the Middle East, trying to diversify those sources. But also, and as we're seeing, food sources. So I just wanted to put that out there because I think a lot of people have this conception that it's this really lopsided relationship that China's plotting this takeover of Russia. Now, again, not that I think that um, they view each other as brotherly people or ideological comrades or anything like that, but I don't think it's nearly as I'm waiting to stab you in the back as a lot of people think it is. Now, of course, that's all diplomatic relations. You're going to, whenever you get the chance, throw away what you don't need, what's no longer useful to you, or stab somebody in the back if it's convenient. That's the way. That's just the nasty nature of diplomacy. But I think people are starting to finally realize that it's not that way. But I think there's a very common misconception that Russian-Chinese relations are very tense and they're only in an alliance of convenience. But with with all of that being said, again, I do think you're right about Putin playing his cards right on this. I think he has been love him or hate him, and again, I know there's very mixed opinions about Putin in our audience in these general spheres, but I will, at the end of the day, despite my personal opinions, my agreements or disagreements with his domestic policy in Russia. Not that I'm a Russian, but I will say objectively he's a good statesman, he's a good diplomat, and he is a master of his craft, so to speak, and that he has navigated Russia spectacularly through these diplomatic situations, managed to pull them out on top more often than not, and you really have to admire that, even if you don't like the man.
right, and it's also, I mean, a lot of what you hear on, uh, let's say nationalist in nationalist chat rooms, you have Russian nationalists who think like, yeah, it wouldn't be a bad idea to balkanize Russia in order that there's less foreign, non-Russian, non-European, non-Slavic influence. It's like you're an idiot. Like if you do that, you're going to lose everything. I mean, that's literally what your enemies want.
Yeah, the Tatars will be reviving their slaving gangs again, raiding their way into southern Russia. I don't know,
It,
but that may be interesting because again, I imagine that the Cossacks would reorganize themselves to response. I'm not saying it'd be a good thing, but I'm saying it'd certainly be interesting content for the show if that happened.
yeah, right. I mean, the problem is like some of these ideas, as understandable as they are, the truth is they're unworkable. Um, you have to understand, like, part of it, you have to understand Russia's history, but you also have to understand Russia's destiny. And what they want is completely, it's unworkable. It's not going to happen. Now, I know this is a minority opinion and so on, and a lot of the same kind of rhetoric has been going on for at least 20 years. They're popular talking points, but I don't take them very seriously. Um, so yeah, what Putin has done is I think he's. I mean, China and Russia have been kind of planning for this early on, including like the 2008 market crash. They always suspected that something like that would happen, and they've had to be prepared for it. Not that that represented any kind of paranoia, meaning that there was any kind of bizarre intentionality in the U.S. to like have a market crash just to affect Russia. I don't mean that, but they just objectively thought that something like that was going to happen soon, based on how they've analyzed American markets, and they had to be prepared for that. And so China and Russia have been working on merging ever closer together for some time, and basically a lot of their predictions about where the West would go, what they would do, have happened on time or even a little faster than they expected. But mechanisms were either already in place or they could um, quickly draw them up. Like the Swiss alternative, for instance, is an example of that, right?
I
They,
do have to say, just on that point, there's been this weird over the past 25, 30 years, I would say ever since the fall of the Soviet Union, this weird dynamic between these three, between the US, Russia, and China, where in Washington, in Beijing, and in Moscow, they all ask themselves, who do I align myself with? There's been the proposals of chimerica, like what we had in the late Cold War, of the position, probably the neoliberals and the neoconservatives, of, hey, let's align ourselves together and let's be the massive economic engine of the world and let's push towards globalism. And then, at least from an American perspective, you had the more conservative, paleoconservative idea of let's reconcile with Russia. They're no longer communist. They're a European Christian nation like us. Maybe we have some common ground here. And then, of course, in Russia, there's been the sentiments that, hey, maybe we should try to mend relations with America and the West, sort of the parallel to that. And then there's also been the idea in Russia that maybe we can't trust the West and we need to go to China. And then, of course, China has done a very good job at walking again that tightrope, playing both sides, saying, well, the Americans are the largest economy in the world, they're the sole superpower. Let's be on good terms with them, but let's also work to enrich our relationship with Russia. So it's been this very interesting dynamic where they all oscillate between each other over these past 30 years. Now, again, things are finally starting to get set in stone, especially as relations between the West and Russia and the West and China tend to freeze over, I would say, since about 2012, 2013 to the present day. But it was a very interesting period there in those couple decades after the fall of the Soviet Union, watching where these players would go, watching who would ally with who and what deals would be made between these countries.
yeah, and that's another thing that we've been watching is more and more countries are not, granted they're part of what's called the global south, but there are other countries that are maybe not aligning, but they're being careful about their decisions. uh, uh, let's say they're partnering with America, but they're not doing everything America is asking. There's been some examples of Japan doing this, but more notable examples from New Zealand, um, because they basically see that China economically is the future in their part of the world. Uh, And also culturally, I would say America has taken great pain and effort to distinguish itself from the rest of the world. Gone are the days of the Bush era, wars for democracy and freedom, and now they're basically for woke values. If you look at, like, let's say something like gay marriage, and you look at that great Eurasian plain from, let's say, Turkey, Turkey and Russia, all the way to Japan, the Russian Arctic, all the way down to Indonesia. There's only one country that has gay marriage, and that's Taiwan, right? It just doesn't exist. And so Mackinder's ideas from a century ago about the, the great, Eurasian heartland being far more traditional than the rest of the world. Let's say we're excluding Africa in this case for simplicity's sake. But he's right about that, and that bears itself out to this day. Even though what kinds of values and what defines the liberal West is different than it was 100 years ago, but that trend is still there. It's still persistent. And Russia and China, I think, understand this. This is part of their soft power, um, and it's why they don't involve themselves when they do trade with a country's internal culture and politics. So they're playing the great Mackinder game here. They know that as long as they stick together, uh, America and the West will be thwarted. They will not be able to make significant inroads into that area. Um, you could even argue. I guess we can move on
Well,
shortly.
yeah, I
To,
actually had something to say about that. I do think that also in something we've lost in the West and particularly in the United States, this idea of looking back at your own history and thinking long term into the future. I think especially the nature of democracy, especially modern democracy, has really done a number on that. I think just with the mentality of the Russians and the Chinese, they can look at what happened during the Cold War, during the Sino-Soviet split, and especially when U.S.-Chinese relations began to thaw,
yeah,
what it happened and how it collapsed the Soviet Union and the global communist bloc, so to speak. And I do think that they have learned their lessons that if in the current geopolitical climate with an Atlanticist power like the United States, if they turn on each other, they're both doomed. Maybe one before the other, but as soon as one falls, the other is next. And I think we saw that with the U.S. dealings with China throughout the 90s, and really, I do think it was a more subtle way with the way a lot of the globalists and the neoliberals approach China, trying to go more into integration and really make the country so codependent on each other to the point where they would create globalism by just sort of globalism by economic blackmail of both respective countries. And I do think that the strategists in Beijing and Moscow have looked at this situation and realized no matter what disputes or disagreements they might have with China at this present moment, they can't afford to be against each other.
right. They can't. And the project basically since the early '90s has been to infiltrate the former Soviet zone and to infiltrate, uh, basically the pan-Arabist ideas that, in some ways, persisted during the '60s, '70s, and even '80s. So to disrupt that space, um, you could you could see that with Afghanistan, this is kind of the case. Like, I think America kind of understood, if it didn't already understand it, that if you can't, if you really can't change fundamentally a country like Iraq, then you need to create something within it that is so destabilizing that it can never be a threat to you or your partners in the Middle East, right? So in this case, I'm talking about Israel and Saudi Arabia, but it also includes Qatar and United Arab Emirates and so on. Uh, but that hasn't worked out. And in the same way, I think America, being in Afghanistan, uh, fulfilled the same kind of purpose. It delayed the project of a kind of return of a certain balance of power. It delayed it by 2 decades, but they are move. It does seem that they're moving out, and the Germans have completely left now, and the Taliban frankly, controls more of the country than it did just prior to the American invasion in 2001.
You bring up
So,
an interesting point, but I just do have one thing I want to get to first. One very brief thing. Another story. So, did you hear about the Delta variant?
oh yeah,
Yeah, real scary stuff there. We got
up
allegedly
variant.
came out of India, and again, just briefly going to touch on this because this is still technically developing news, and there's a lot I want to get into with the Middle East and Afghanistan. Apparently, out of India, a Delta variant of the coronavirus has developed, and that is the new scare. And they already have, I believe, California at least, and a few other localities and countries throughout the world have began reimposing restrictions that were almost just lifted about a month, 2 months ago at most. Sometimes in some cases even just weeks ago. And this is what they're fear mongering about. This is what they're bringing up, and some would speculate that it looks like they need to, especially after the failure of some of their other plans, really drive this up, really drive the hysteria up. But we'll keep you posted on the stories with that. But I did figure it was
It's
worth mentioning in passing. But I can tell
no,
you
it's
very,
good.
I can tell
It
you.
ought to be called the Build Back Better variant.
Oh yeah, yeah, the the triple B variant. We got to watch out for that. That's frightening stuff there. But I can tell you're very eager about this Afghanistan thing, so I'll let you take over from here.
Yeah, I mean, so the Taliban is quickly expanding, despite some heavy losses in certain areas. Every major city is surrounded now, and they've secured the border with Tajikistan, and they're in the process of securing the border and border crossings in Uzbekistan. And what's happening is there are already hundreds of refugees filling into Uzbekistan. So, the Taliban, just as I predicted, is legitimizing itself. I was a warlord, so you could be a lawyer. Um, but no, in all seriousness, we're going to see Afghanistan go into a civil war pretty quickly. Uh, the government that the Russians had set up during the time of the Soviet Union lasted for about 3 years. And basically, after Yeltsin got elected, he could no longer or refused any longer to support the government with supplies. So it fell thereafter. And they had that civil war between the old Mujahideen and the Taliban. And the Taliban was a faction that originally grew out of the Mujahideen. And, because the Mujahideen wasn't like, was literally not, I don't know, Salafist enough.
Yeah, and again, the Mujahideen, what it was is it was primarily that very hardline Sunni Islamist group, but there were, of course, other dissenter groups such as the Northern Alliance, which were a very pro-Iranian Shia and pro-Shia group that had the support of even the United States and Russia post-withdrawal. But again, a lot of what happened with the breakup of the Taliban was the people, and again, the faction that a lot of people that Osama bin Laden brought to Afghanistan, where the people were saying, well, you know what, this isn't going far enough. We need to go even more hardline with this. And as you were saying, they became the Taliban, broke off from the Mujahideen, and that Taliban nowadays has become at least from my understanding, at least from the way I'm looking at the situation. Let me know if you have any further comments on this, has become the new umbrella organization that encompasses all the groups that want to reassert control over Afghanistan, and they are just jutting out all over the place. As you were saying, they control more territory than the Taliban did in 2001 during the time of the American invasion. That's the point where it's gotten. And even, again, it's reported that even Taliban leaders are surprised of how quickly they're advancing across the country. now in the absence of U.S. and Western forces. And what I speculated last week, and which we'll certainly get into this, but what I still speculate to this point is that once the Taliban takes control of Afghanistan, like the Mujahideen, I do believe that it will not be the end of it, and that we will see the infighting reemerge. That these groups that were really only allies at convenience of the Taliban may start to break away. The Iranians, with how much their reach has been, and we'll get into some stuff in Syria and Iraq and Lebanon, but I don't imagine that they'll just let Shia Muslims in Afghanistan, have this opportunity to put their foot in the door. I don't imagine they'll just leave them hanging. I mean, Iranian operations in Afghanistan have been ongoing since the war. In fact, they were actually a cooperative partner in the U.S. invasion of Iraq. Believe it or not, Soleimani was actually the one who helped draw up some of the invasion plans and helped support some of these resistance groups. So, yeah, there's that for irony. But I do imagine that will become another ground of Iranian influence in particular, because the Russians, again, I think even though it's been 40 years, give or take, those wounds are still pretty fresh when it comes to getting involved in Afghanistan. I think the Chinese generally don't have interest, so I do think it'll become a battle of influence between mainly Iran and Pakistan going forward with the way the Taliban and the various militant groups fragment there. But I imagine the Taliban, at least for the foreseeable future, that being the next few years, will be the main political power in Afghanistan, and that resistance will slowly start to mount against them with support of powers like Iran.
Yeah, in a way, America's presence there was, partly to contain Iran and partly to stymie inroads by China into Afghanistan, and to keep kind of tabs on Russia. So I think America moving out of that region, in some ways, it's a bit of a realignment. Like if they can't have, their prize goals, then they'll keep what they've got. Uh, I think maybe we're seeing now a new strategy developing, uh, primarily in the Black Sea, but also with a desire for regime change in Turkey, and kind of an unresolved plan about what they're going to do in eastern Syria and Iraq. Uh, this is a lot been there's been a lot that's been going on there this week and last week.
Absolutely, and again, I do think the situation in Afghanistan is still very volatile, and we'll have to see how it plays out. Again, there always is that possibility where Biden just changes course and says, or whoever Biden's handlers that week says, well, it looks like we're returning to Afghanistan. The situation has become too unstable there. But I don't see that happening. You actually had
Hmm.
the delusion of somebody like Bill Kristol saying that the U.S. may reverse its course of action in Afghanistan after public outcry that we're abandoning Afghanistan for 20 years. And apparently, the true conservatives are so anti-populist that they refuse to even look at an opinion poll. But that's aside the point. And moving on to the Middle East, just as an aside news, apparently at age 88 years old, former Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld is now dead. So there's that. Probably one of the, you know, clearly the show, not fans of the man, but I will say probably one of the more influential people of the 21st century so far. Not for good reasons either. I'll completely admit, for completely bad reasons. But I don't. Of course, he wasn't in any position of power right now, so this isn't going to have any real repercussions or bearings on any current geopolitical situation. But I can just imagine the outpour of the people who called him a violent war criminal 20 years ago finally just shedding. It's sort of like what they did with John McCain, shedding a tear, saying, "We've lost such a wonderful man that I thought was a ghoul years ago. That I wasn't necessarily wrong about that, but again, he said something about Blumph, so it's very sad that he died again." So expect this very like feigned mourning to come out and about. So just keep that in mind. But oh boy, rather busy week in the Middle East, especially with the dealings of Turkey, Iran, and the U.S. and let's pull up our Syria map here. Let's see. I did not load the Syria map. I am being very negligent today, so I will pull that up. But very busy week in Syria, as I said, and I will pull up that map to show you guys, make up for my negligence there. But of course, a lot of the action is concentrated in northern Syria, and not just northeastern or northwestern Syria. Now, plenty of action in both, but all across northern Syria. So, starting with the usual news, of course, you have Russian SAA and pro-Syrian government forces pushing further into Idlib, doing their regular bombing and shelling routine. You have the Turkish forces proper moving on the Kurds, and they are amassing near uh, Manjib, and it is speculated by some that they are preparing a larger invasion force to take care of the Kurdish problem in northeastern Syria. Now, they
Mhm.
had their skirmishes with Assad and his allies a few weeks back, the SAA and their allies a week or two back, but it seems like the concentration of their forces, you can see there on the map with those dark blue little mortar shell symbols, that's where they're really concentrating on the quote unquote SDF and pro Kurdish forces in north. Actually, that's more towards northwestern Syria, but just northeastern Syria in general, the SDF controlled territories. So you've had your skirmishes there. Of course, Deir ez-Zor has been the site of quite a few interesting events. The Iranians under Raisi did test their new rockets there to pretty decent effect. And of course, that is also the site of U.S. airstrikes on pro Iranian forces in Deir ez-Zor near the SDF Syrian government border with the fighting back of ISIS cells and other terrorist cells. And of course, that is all on top of these still ongoing nuclear negotiations in Vienna between the U.S. and Iran. So it creates this very interesting dynamic. You also had in Iraq, Turkey amassing forces on their border, and very conspicuous drone swarming attacks on Kurdish military positions in northern Iraq. Now, you saw this in Armenia and Azerbaijan with the Azeris using the drone swarm tactics. You saw it in Syria, you see it in Libya. Pretty much anywhere where Turkey and their proxies go, this tactic gets employed with the swarming of drones to the point where these are all one use drones. They go straight to their target and they don't return. Of course, they're strapped with, explosive and other weaponry. The point, but again, they're a one use weapon and they're very useful at what they do. It's a very useful tactic on parts of the Turks, real fourth generation warfare. And we've seen the Russians develop counter response to that and the Syrians develop counter response to that, particularly near Latakia with, again, a lot of these formerly Turkish backed groups at least employing these tactics. You saw it used to much greater effect in Armenia because Armenian air defenses weren't as well upgraded or integrated with Russians as, for example, Syria was. Of course, it's been used to some degree in Libya, and it looks like the Iraqi Kurds are finally getting this turn. And Erdogan seems very determined. Again, it does make you wonder about the internal political state of Turkey. I don't think they're out from a major election, at least for the next couple of years here, but it looks like he's really trying to solidify support and take on the Kurdish problem head on. And you speculate, and I'll let you get into this and just the other Middle Eastern news in general, that there is mounting pressure in Washington against
Right.
Erdogan and trying to see him out.
Yeah. So there was a statement that was issued by the U.S. It was either today or yesterday. So it'll be 1 or 2 days old by the time this program airs, and basically their dissatisfaction with Erdogan has been outlined on these points. One, his mismanagement, in their eyes, of uh, you know his tactics with regards to the Kurds in Syria and Iraq, the Caucasus, but even just as important is the lack of transparency and corruption and the suppression of democratic values. Notice that there was a gay parade that was busted up just a few days ago in Istanbul. So the pressure is going to go on Erdogan pretty hard and pretty soon. Uh, the Turkish economy is not doing great, even though he has officially started with their Bosphorus detour, if you will. This is that area that they're basically building another canal, and it will allow them to. And it's been an idea for decades, but and they've been inching along ever so gradually the last decade, but they're determined to get this this new canal built because what that'll do is it will allow trading and control of this corridor in a way that bypasses many of the international laws that are um, tied into the Bosphorus. So it will give him greater leeway, essentially. And now, is it too little, too late? It could be. It could be that the pressure might get very hot on him, and this project might have to be thwarted. But it is one of the ways that Erdogan has tried to advance the economy as best as he can. But Erdogan isn't going to be such an easy pushover, and that's because although he is losing popularity, there was some regional elections where he has lost, including in Ankara and in Istanbul, but there were some other towns like I think it's Izmir. So if this so he while he
Well,
is losing some.
I will ask just real quick if you have clarification on this, because again, I haven't kept up with these smaller Turkish elections. Who is Erdogan's party losing to? Are they losing from a more nationalistic direction, or are they losing to more liberal forces?
That's a good question. I didn't honestly. I just read that he's losing less. He's losing favor with the public. I wouldn't presume that it's the same party that he's losing to in Ankara as he is losing in Istanbul, because Ankara is far more conservative than Istanbul is. Like there would never be a gay protest in Ankara, but there will be ones in Istanbul, right? Uh, Now he's suppressed them for quite some time, but them marching now is in a way it's a flex, that the Americans, that America's back, and new pressure will be applied. He's not what they want, and you could see that even Obama wanted it to get rid of him. But like I say, he does have a certain hardcore support, and if I don't know if America will risk doing what it did back in 2016 in order to get rid of him, because what did it do then is it increased support for Erdogan, right? They resent this. Turks resent the meddling, right? And frankly, no matter how unpopular he may have become recently, there isn't. I don't think that there isn't a figure right now that can unify the country, and so people will by default choose him. It's kind of like a scenario that's been going on for decades in Iran, where yeah, they're not there's a fairly large swath of the population that is not happy with the mullahs, but like if there's any more American and Israeli meddling, they will by default support them, because there's a pride there, and there's a resentment towards this meddling in what they consider their own internal affairs.
Yes, because I know it is hard to imagine as an American, as a Westerner, with just how much to hell our political systems have gone. But in countries like Iran, in countries like Turkey, while again you may be on a different civilizational level than them, while you may be opposed to them or dislike them or whatever, there still is a sense of national cohesion there. That even my country's bad guys are better than the people outside who want to take us over. Whereas
Right.
in the United States, that national cohesion doesn't exist because of, I mean, the political class hasn't done anything to curry its favor. But for example, during a let's go with the very obvious one, the very candid one. World War II, okay? You had a lot of Republicans, a lot of right wingers who didn't like FDR, but of course, as soon as war rolled around, everyone fell in line. UK, Churchill wasn't necessarily the most popular civilian leader, but as soon as wartime rolled around, he had a unity government and parliament. But point being is, when governments actually at least have the credibility of their people, whether deserved or undeserved, whether they've gained that through blatant propaganda or actually doing their jobs, they can rally a people around the flag. And I thought you kind of saw this in some places during COVID. You saw this, I'd say, to an extent in France, where people really got together as a nation, and Macron's approval rating shot up much higher than they had any business being. Same with Merkel. Same, pretty much, of course, with countries like the U.S. and Canada, and even the U.K. That didn't really happen, but in a lot of continental Europe, you saw this where, at least for a few months, at least when people thought this was going to be really bad, that there was this sense of national unity that was reinvigorated, that the population wasn't so polarized, atomized, and divided from one another, that they could still realize, yeah, differences X, Y, and Z, but we're French, we're German above all else. Whereas in the United States, that common idea of being an American has more or less faded. I would say has been on a gradual decline since the 1960s, and of course, it being a country as young as America and really in as primordial form as America, it wasn't that strong anyway. But just gradual pressures on that forming identity grounded in nothing. But point being is, there are some places in the world where national cohesion still exists. To make a long story short.
Yeah, yeah, and there's just frankly too much history, and in some of those instances, they've had to fight in order to determine a space for themselves as a people. Um, there is an ethnogenesis that has been there and has been developing and evolving for, in many cases, for millennia. And they're not propositional nations, right? They don't propose that anybody can be a Turk or anybody can be, let's say, an Azerbaijani. I'm just pulling any kind of examples, and so um, that's been hard fought for, and they're not going to just like lie down. Obviously, countries like Iraq, you know, were essentially defeated, but they're persisting, and now basically this this gay op that they did on Iraq has backfired on the US. I mean, to a great extent, but as I said, they're just as happy to leave these countries, in a broken mess,
Uh,
because that's just something,
I
that's something less that they have to worry about.
I have to go on a tangent again, but you do have to appreciate Likud's brazenness, in particular when it comes to the Iraq War. How they were very gung
Yeah.
ho for this. How they thought it would be the
Yes.
domino effect that would just topple all of their enemies, when it did the exact opposite. And just really the short sightedness of people like Netanyahu, people like, I think Avigdor Lieberman was the Israeli. He was Netanyahu's defense minister for years, up until like 2018, whenever Netanyahu was in office. Point being, very influential Israeli, very influential Likudnik. But and even among the people who were part of Project for a New American Century or these other new conservative organizations in America, they thought that this would just be a chain reaction that set the Middle East completely in America's favor, when it was quite the opposite. That they were so certain of themselves, that they were so hubristic, and it turned out the complete opposite way of what they were expecting. And really, I would say this is really the culmination of this these past few
Yeah.
years, but especially just all the events going on recently. And moving into Lebanon, of course, there's been more of the civil unrest with the economic crisis that's plagued the country for several years now, of course, that really took a, and pardon the expression, took a blow when that one port had the explosion, which, again, that's been completely memory hold. You never hear anyone talk about the Lebanon explosion anymore. What caused that? What was the response to it? What are we going to do? Of course, once Macron pulled out of his diplomatic efforts after he decided it's too hard to weave through these ethnic and religious conflicts, the entire world had seemed to just forgotten about it. And today, or a few days ago at least, they were out in the streets, they were protesting, they were raiding the Lebanese central bank, and it's really a level of civil unrest I hadn't seen. Now, of course, you've seen this culminating in the rise of more, gee, how do you put it? Perhaps illiberal parties is just the best umbrella term, of Hezbollah and their allies gaining more and more influence in the electoral system. And it looks like, and again, I don't even think it's a religious, political, or economic. It's certainly an economic thing, but I don't think it's even a religious, political, or cultural difference. At least at this point, now it can very easily boil over into that. I do think Lebanon's been powder cake for quite some time, but it looks like just economic pressures, economic despair has mounted to the point where the Lebanese people are once again taking to the streets, and we'll see how this works out. Now, of course, this going, I believe I already saw some low levels in the State Department denouncing this as Iranian meddling causing unrest in Lebanon. When, of course, the sanctions regime that we
Yeah.
think apparently we not only have the authority but the capability to enforce the entire world to conform with our sanctions. That's certainly not helping the situation. But again, it's just day by day in the Middle East in particular, things are unraveling from the grand vision of PNAC, of the geostrategists of the 1990s, and of the pre 9/11 era in general, to the point where these things that if you would, of course, hindsight is 2020. Now I know it's 2021, so the pun doesn't work as well. But if they would have just taken a moment to have some introspection, to look at what they were actually proposing, and look at the impending challenge in the region, say in the 90s, say in the 2000s, the state of the Middle East today is no less than hubris on the part of Washington, D.C. And I say that definitively, beyond all the ethnic, religious, resource, whatever conflicts, it all comes back to the idea that the sole global superpower at the time thought it could reshape an entire region, thought that they could implement these grand plans that any empire of previous centuries would have realized this is going to take decades. I'm probably going to be dead by the time this plan comes to fruition, if it even does at all. We thought we could do that within the two terms of one president.
Right, and I think even the Israelis, I think they know what the Americans wanted to hear before the invasion of Iraq, and I think they knew Iraq and its polities much better. And this is why they said to them like, "Oh, you're going to bring democracy," and of course, like Westerners, but particularly Americans, almost go giddy with the idea that they're spreading their religion around the world, and
Yeah, especially at the again in context of the post Cold War era of the 1990s, when again America was that sole superpower, when they had toppled the Nazis, they toppled the communists. We rule the world. We're going to topple the Islamic fundamentalists, of course. That drive was only, further driven by 9/11. Look, they attacked us on our own soil. This is a new Pearl Harbor. Certainly, PNAC did not predict this. Certainly, they had no idea anything like this would happen. Completely organic response, whatever. But you do have a point that they do again, and you've seen this evolve, and especially with how bizarre of a civilization America has been, at least in terms of it being the latest standard bearer of Western civilization, where, again, in 2003, on the eve of the invasion of Iraq, again, our civilizational truth might have been liberty and democracy. Now, of course, it's equality and justice and standing up for the quote unquote oppressed. And you see, I mean, those things, again, if you take an objective look at it, those things aren't too far apart. But in terms of just experiencing the cultural whiplash as somebody who actually lives in America, I can see how somebody might be taken in by that. But point being is, you have a point that they get very excited the idea of spreading their civilizational truth to a rival civilization.
Right, right. Because they believe their values are like literally universal. They're not. They can't possibly not be true, right? They're the future. That's it doesn't matter how long you've been here. It's kind of like discovering Pluto. Like, well, I mean, Pluto's just a reality, man. Your telescopes weren't good enough, and that's why you didn't see it. So are most of the arguments for democracy. Um, Even though these civilizations have been there for thousands of years, and I think they're pretty determined that they're going to stay there, no matter how much like the borders will change. Um, and they'll find their own way of navigating their own future. But yeah, so I just find it funny that it's kind of like the sort of immigrant assimilation game that a lot of former or a lot of Anglosphere countries play. Um, Now this is going back a while, but I've mentioned the story before. There was a friend of mine that was returning back to. He was a Bosnian Serb. He was returning back to Bosnia, and the people at this dinner party were like in shock that he would do that. And like one guy, an Anglo guy, was just beside himself, but why? It just seemed implausible. Anyhow, so it's this kind of, and it also, I suppose the adoption of these values in order to create identities in the West has caused this uh, this deracinating of the public. And as the culture moves and as a different demographics shift, they can't come up with an argument that's based on just them surviving for their own sake, um and not for the sake of democracy. They simply can't untangle those two, even though basically the people in power want them subjugated. So yeah, it's just funny to me. I won't belabor the point anymore.
It is, and especially in the amount of time, the rapid amount of time that it fell apart, because a lot of other look, we're far from the first empire to collapse, and unless I don't know the world ends tomorrow, we won't be the last empire to collapse either.
Yeah.
But it's just the rate at which it's happening and the circumstances under which it's happening. Because you've had these great empires that, of course, one may think Persia, for example, if you want just a very basic example, uh, just fell to conquest, fell to the sword. You had other ones like Rome, a gradual decline over the course of centuries of various ethnic tensions, political corruption, overextension, etc. All the various things that they list. The fall of these European empires, where they really go out with a whimper rather than a bang, where again, they voluntarily decolonize and lay down their arms. I mean, of course, the world wars didn't help that, but point being is, even the victors, such as France, such as Britain, voluntarily destroyed their own empires. But just the nature of which America is collapsing. Now, again, we're also not the first empire to collapse from hubris, but just the amount of hubris and the way in which it's playing out. Maybe it's because I'm experiencing it in real time. I think
Hmm.
it's different, but again, there is just something so fascinating about watching this, and something just we're really you don't want to act like oh I was right. I saw this coming from a million miles away, but it's very vindicating to see that something built on such flimsy ideas and not any real ethnic or cultural basis had fallen apart. Because again, post 1945, and that's a generous take. America was supposed to be this ideological bastion to rival communism. So they made liberalism. I mean, not that liberalism was ever good and that it ever went wrong, but they made American liberalism from yeah, okay, that was part of the founding to no, this is our core identity, and moved it away from it being an ethnic nation founded by Anglo-Saxon, Scotch-Irish settlers who built this place from the ground up, who tamed this wild land. Again, there was something of an American ethnogenesis, and of course that was crushed at various
Yeah.
points. We've been over this, actually, I think we did an entire episode, nearly an entire episode on this, but point being is, after the Cold War, of course, and the new after World War II into the Cold War with the new dynamics and everything, it had to become a battle of ideology. It had to be our ideas are better than yours because we have more guns. And I mean, if you had to explain the Cold War in one sentence, right there, as contradictory as that is, and that's how it played out. But again, rather than being a nation of a people of a heritage, it's a nation of an idea of, well, anyone can be an American or anyone can be a liberal, and look, they're liberal too. And it even seeped to the outside world to the point where most anti-Americanism in the Western world, in the first world that exists today, you think Canada, you think the UK, France, whatever, their main criticisms of America, their main angle of attack is, look, we're so much more liberal and we're even better Americans than you are. You should be ashamed of yourself. And again,
Right, right.
that's just getting into, and very rarely do you hear the criticism of, well, there were foreign power occupying us. Now you're starting to see that more with the nationalistic movements, even though, again, the state of European nationalism is, I would say, very strange right now. I think people are much too harsh on it for as young as this modern incarnation is. But again, I'm getting off on a tangent here. But point being is, it is interesting to watch when these ideas are put under scrutiny, put to the sword both in a figurative and literal sense, how quickly they crumble and falter.
Yeah. I mean, we're basically also seeing in real time the development of like two different Americas. Like a dual America is forming, and whether that's Fauci saying that based on who gets the jab, or whether it's Trump visiting the border in Texas, uh, and the debacle that was the election. Even if you subscribe that there was absolutely no meddling in by deep state and corporations that resulted in let's say the outcome in nefarious ways of the 2020 election, even if you subscribe to that it was just we were just fortifying, man. And there's decent arguments for that. All the major cities, all of them had suburbs that voted overwhelmingly Democrat, and it wasn't just in swing states or um, states that we knew were going to go blue or states that were red. That did happen. Um, that said, there does seem to have been irregularities, and let's say even let's say it was ostensibly a fair election. Um, all the boasting that went on months before the election about what the results were going to be, about this that corporation, like say Amazon that played a role. Um, even designing the absentee ballot forms, and the ballot forms for prisoners, like that seems like really, really excessive, right? That doesn't feel like a normal American election, and it's because they had to get rid of Trump. Like they simply could not handle another 4 years of Trump. Now I understand the reasoning behind that. That is that another 4 years would have eroded America's standing and confidence in America in the world. But
Yes,
I
this
believe,
this man was a direct refutation of at least the modern incarnation of America, at least the current
yeah,
American empire, to the point where his existence, let alone him being able to hold any position of influence, especially the president of the United States, was a self-defeating prospect from day one. And I think that was a lot of the appeal Trump had to these disaffected people when he ran for election. Now, going back to the fortification of the elections, I've said since November, I've said since the entire controversy started, Trump was weak in 2020. Trump did underperform in 2020. Trump was a disappointment, and that I have no issue believing he could have lost because he disappointed his followers. Again, sort of touching on the 5% of white men who abstained from voting, so to speak. But
Right.
again, I don't think it was. Again, I think the election wasn't as fortified as I say it was, or maybe it was too fortified. Point being is I I I, I don't think it may have been the most honest process. So I'm not making any outright allegations. Let's be clear about that, YouTube. But I don't think it was the most straightforward process. But again, going back to the point, they needed him out, and again, this goes back into the real narrative battle for America. I mean, fundamentally, Biden's campaign slogan when he said, "This is a battle for the soul of America," he was right. And again, but it was a very strange battle of the broad Trumpian coalition of people who thought old America could be revived, or that we need to completely, ban the project and start from square one altogether, versus the people who are satisfied with the status quo or embittered leftists who think, oh, at least Biden's not as racist.
Right, right, I mean, you can see the process is that the U.S. has been on for for like let's say the last 40, 50 years, despite its strength. Um, every outcome, has a kind of there's an unintended consequence that hurts America more than helps it. Like, some people, for instance, I don't want to get too into the weeds here, but just to sort of back up, I think what's happened since the election and January the 6th and so on. I will say, some people, for instance, feel very strongly that the CIA was responsible for getting the Ayatollah Khomeini into power. Um, Now, there's all kinds of places where you can go to delve deeper into that. Let's just say let's say that's true, or let's say I prescribe to it. Um, if you say that, and that was a bulwark at that time, right, in order to deal with Russia, right, because they also created and substantiated the Mujahideen, right? That was something else under Jimmy Carter. So it was understood that if they appealed to the religious sentiments, then they could overcome the Ba'athist movement and the Soviet Union. The Pan-Arabist movement and the Soviet Union. And what happened was, like, they basically, in a sense, what that did is it backfired on them, just the same way that Iraq backfired on them, right? I think they thought that, like, Iraq wasn't going to become just this, you know, enclave of Iranian interests, but it very much has. And now, America is in a tight spot where, like, what are you going to do? Are you going to bring in 30,000 troops, or are you going to leave? You're in this kind of space that's not neither here nor there. If things get really bad in Afghanistan, like, are you going to return? Will you have to return? Like, where is this going? And there's a lot of uncertainty, and I think the same applies for America, right? So they had to get rid of Trump, but at what cost? And now you have I mean, the number of people who believe that the election was rigged or stolen in some way has risen by 4% since January. So now they're at like 51% believe that. And um, like, that's going to set up like a kind of a dual American society. And, that's part of like why they have to create this, you know, white supremacist menaces everywhere. Uh, it's the most, the Biden administration says this over and over again. It's the most dangerous thing to develop in the U.S. that threatens everyday Americans. Yada yada yada.
And it's even an
Um,
international effort, and this started
and
under Trump, where
it's
they
why
went.
they have to focus on, the yeah.
But it was even an international effort, and again, I know Biden's
Go
really
ahead.
ramped up this white supremacist sort of rhetoric, but you even had Trump's State Department or Pompeo targeting "quote unquote" white supremacists and far right extremists in European countries in European political parties. I think Germany and Italy were the big ones where they were going after some members of the ADF and the various right wing parties in European countries. Of course, they'll give more of a pass to countries like Poland, Lithuania, etc., because they're right on the front line. But
Great.
like in a lot of these Western European countries, they were even cracking down on that to the point where not only at home in the heart of the empire, but abroad. And I don't imagine Biden's State Department is any different. I believe they've even put statements out about that. And I can imagine Anthony Blinken, who, oh boy, the man is really, maybe I exaggerate, really a modern incarnation of Trotsky, if you will. Uh, yeah, I don't imagine he's too friendly to these sort of movements either. And I don't, again, I expect some sort of effort to have a concerted Western countries movement, NATO countries movement, whatever, to root out white supremacists in, for example, both the U.S., Canada, UK, France, whatever. And of course, you had issues in France. One of the you had I don't remember whether it was an active or retired general catching scrutiny and is being investigated and cracked down upon because he said, well, and we all know who controls the media both in France and outside of France. So again, you're getting these sort of things, you're getting these sort of crackdowns, and you make a good point, but I think a lot of people don't realize that, like, yeah, this is happening here, but the tentacles of the empire stretch very far.
Yeah, so the situation is becoming more and more untenable. You have these fires that are sparking up here and there. They're having quite a time trying to put them out. Where the only way to keep these countries together, or under this ideology, which is creating a lot of resentment, and particularly with the majority of the population, the only recourse is to have ever harsher measures against the majority of the population. Now, of course, there's a large swath of them, who identify strongly as liberals, that are okay with this. They know they know how the power has shifted. They know where the ideology is heading, and they're adapting to it. But the vast majority of these people, well, I would say well over 50% are not really on board. And what it's going to take to keep these countries intact and together is going to be more authoritarianism. That there is no other way. And what's funny is we've been basically saying this for like the last, in a really strong way, the last 2 3 years. um I would say particularly after Charlottesville. I even made the claim that, if America ever really truly does pull out of Afghanistan, that will be like the beginning of the end, because in a sense, like, its goals have not been met. It will have to settle for something else. And we kind of went over that. The prize was Russia and China, and to a lesser extent Iran, and those aren't coming around their way. And so now the internal problems get even more intense.
Yes, and I do think we've been discussing this probably since this time last year that a withdrawal from Afghanistan, when of course peace negotiations with the Taliban and Trump's State Department originally started, that if there is a substantial withdrawal, if not a complete withdrawal, it's going to be a look. While I said at that point I still stand by this, I think getting Afghanistan is a good thing. I think we're wasting much more time, money, resources, and lives than we ever should have been wasting there. But point being is just knowing the people who are in charge of this behemoth, if they're giving up on Afghanistan, then things are going to go down. Something big is happening. Now, I would have said something big domestically is happening, which it looks like that's going to be the case, but it looks like really they are trying to shore up the empire, particularly domestically, really, again, bring that enforced unity, as you were saying. And I do believe, as part of again, the coronavirus stuff, when that initially happened, now, of course, we were all nobody knew. A lot of people on this side, the opinion was split down the middle. Oh, this is very serious. Oh, this is not serious at all. But I do think, regardless of what they knew with how serious it would be, at some point around March through May of 2020 and continuing onwards, they saw this as something that they could use to bring people in line with the regime. This is something we can all unify around. This is something we can build a sense of national cohesion around because things are getting bad at home. And then I would say that is directly contradictory to the racial tensions and the Black Lives Matter things that started literally just months later. And again, I I would say I think among the American elite, if I had to speculate, and I'm not going to speculate too far, there was very rivaling takes. Now this one isn't original at all. Oh, Trump can be controlled versus Trump must be gotten rid of. That was obvious point number one. But I do think there was another one saying we need to keep the American people divided, polarized, and on their toes at all times. It makes them easier to control. Or we need them to fall in line and form a national unity because we're not going to make it otherwise. And I think that's a debate going on nowadays. I think that's you could, despite how much they went hand in hand, I think you could contrast the coronavirus response and Black Lives Matter that they were really both again going either of those directions. Even though it is funny because the COVID stuff, the restrictions, the lockdowns, the masks, the vaccines, that also turned out to be very divisive. And I think after about 30 years, if not longer, of them trying to intentionally divide the population, they're finally seeing the consequences of their actions start to actually happen. And that seeing that, hey, this isn't just long-term things we can speculate about this. This isn't just what people thought, like, oh, this will happen long after we're gone, we don't care. And that they're realizing the consequences of the way they've chosen to run their empire.
Right. And then I remember a few years ago, I would say back in 2018, or it might have been the first month or two of 2019, I said, it's pretty simple to understand, right? Like the implicit message is unity will depend on, the disprivileging of of whites. Like that's what it will depend on. Everybody kind of implicitly understands that. And so there's a kind of a growing hatred of lower income whites or just, I guess middle income blue collar whites as well. And like that's what it depends on. Like hiring quotas, representation in media. This is what they're preparing for. I mean, in Canada, we just had an article that was printed featuring BlackRock saying Canada has to reach 100 million before the end of this century. So that gives us about 79 and a half years to essentially triple our population, or else what? So you know how it's going to go, and that's what they're basically preparing for. And I mean, do they? I guess in the same sense, they don't like. Are they willing to leave a wreck behind? Because they will do that. I mean, no matter how this plays out. Um, yeah, it's immensely frustrating uh, being here, but at the same time, we can forecast where things are going to go, how how determined they are to move in that direction. And it's kind of easy to see how this will play a very big destabilizing role. We often made the joke when you first invited me to the war report that, in a sense, time is like we were talking about Russia, and I said time is on their side. Like they can hang back because things will only get more and more difficult internally for Western Europe and for America. And what do you know? Yesterday there was an article from the UN saying that 1.47 million people, refugees, will have to be relocated somewhere within Europe, and I'm presuming that will have to include the states as well to some degree. Although the states always depends on Europe taking in, the refugees for the wars that it instrumentalizes in these areas of the world. So, what is that going to do? Because they're not really like Holland had a study that basically showed there isn't really any benefit to mass migration, at least with the population that the Netherlands is dealing with. That second, third generation are not paying off, right? Um, that it isn't really increasing the tax base all that much at all, even though you can remove the amount of money that went in to establish the first generation there. So yeah, not to go off on a tangent as we usually do, but
Yeah, and these foreign fighters going to places like Syria, Libya, etc., are usually the children, if not the grandchildren,
yeah,
of these economic migrants and these refugees who don't feel at home in this culture, feel like they've been raised in a completely alien area, which they had, and really you get two outcomes to those sort of people. They either assimilate into the nameless, faceless sea of hyper liberalism where they adopt all these liberal values, become pro LGBTQIA, put pronouns in their bio, etc. Or they get very disillusioned and decide to take up arms and go fight for their beliefs and fight for uh, their people in places like Syria and Libya and Yemen, etc. And again, that's the sort of two directions you see this. And man, this show certainly has a way of doing its own thing. Because what I thought was originally going to be the very narrow topics has grown out into yet another wonderful discussion. But that's all I had for that. That's all I had for this episode of the Warport. Now, if you have anything else, we can certainly bring that up now. If not, I can go ahead and bring this week to a close.
no, I think we covered Lebanon. That was the one that I wanted us to touch upon, or add to the list of other countries that we were going to look at. So I guess we're going to see Lebanon quite stabilized, but who knows? I don't think that will lessen Hezbollah's presence and reliance there. I think it will actually encourage even more reliance and support for Hezbollah.
Oh, certainly. I mean, any group that is willing to fill this power vacuum, any group that's willing to assert themselves as the leader, as the strong bulwark for or against this sort of thing, is going to take over. And who is in a better position for that than Hezbollah? But of course, we'll see how that situation develops over the next week or so in Lebanon. So thank you everyone for tuning into this episode of the War Report. I hope you enjoyed it very much. As I know we had a lot of fun doing it. I know we get with these longer episodes, we really get into some of these more deep conversation topics, which you guys seem to like. Don't get me wrong. Plenty of views, plenty of thumbs up for our humble little channel here. But we'll see you guys next time, and goodbye.
Take care.